He was young, ambitious, and fearless, a man who lived for glory and sought immortality on the battlefield. To his men, he was a hero. To his rivals, a reckless troublemaker. His name was George Armstrong Custer. And on that fateful day in June 1876, his legend was sealed in blood. But was it destiny, or something far more sinister? George Armstrong Custer was born on December 5, 1839, in New Rumley, Ohio. He wasn't from a wealthy or influential family. He grew up in a modest home, a restless boy with an oversized sense of adventure. Even as a child, Custer loved stories of war and heroism, idolizing the great military leaders of the past. But no one could have guessed that he himself would one day become a legend. Custer's ambition led him to West Point, but if he hoped to make an impression, it wasn't through discipline. He graduated in 1861, dead last in his class. His record was abysmal, with more demerits than almost any other cadet. Yet despite this, fate had a different plan for him. The Civil War had just begun, and the Union Army needed officers. Custer wouldn't have to wait long for a chance to prove himself. The Civil War became Custer's battlefield of opportunity. He rose to prominence under the command of General George B. McClellan, quickly earning a reputation for daring. While other officers played it safe, Custer led charges straight into the enemy. His aggressive tactics made him a favorite of General Alfred Pleasonton, who promoted him to brigadier general at just 23 years old. Custer was now the youngest general in the Union Army, but it wasn't just his bravery that made him stand out. Custer had a flair for the dramatic. While most soldiers wore standard blue uniforms, he dressed in a custom-made outfit-fringed buckskin jackets, a broad-brimmed hat, and a bright red necktie. He wanted to be noticed. He wanted to be remembered. Custer played a key role at Gettysburg, leading a cavalry charge that stopped Stuart's Confederate forces from flanking the Union Army. His recklessness paid off. Again and again, Custer's willingness to risk everything turned the tide of battle. By the end of the war, he had fought in nearly every major engagement of the Eastern Theater, emerging as one of the Union's most celebrated cavalry officers. But war had made Custer an adrenaline addict. With the fighting over, he struggled to adjust to peacetime. He was given a lower rank, captain in the regular army, but he wasn't a man who could live in obscurity. America's next great conflict would give him a chance to reclaim his glory. The frontier was ablaze. The U.S. government had broken treaty after treaty, pushing Native American tribes further west. In response, the Plains Indians began resisting with increasing force. The government needed a warrior, someone unafraid of battle. And so, Custer was sent west. In 1868, he launched a surprise attack on a Cheyenne village at the Washita River, killing Chief Black Kettle and many of his people. To Washington, it was a victory. To the Plains tribes, it was a massacre. Custer became both feared and hated. But Custer's greatest enemy wasn't on the battlefield. It was in Washington. By the 1870s, the U.S. government was riddled with corruption. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration was plagued by scandal, and Custer, never one to stay quiet, publicly spoke against it. He testified before Congress about corruption in the War Department, directly implicating Grant's brother. It was a bold move, too bold. It made him powerful enemies, and those enemies didn't forget. By 1874, Custer was back in action, leading an expedition into the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. Gold was discovered, and soon thousands of settlers flooded into lands that had been promised to the Sioux. Tensions escalated. War was inevitable. And Custer? He was at the center of it all. June 1876. Custer's orders were clear. Locate the Lakota and Cheyenne encampment and wait for reinforcements. But waiting was never in his nature. The lure of another great victory was too strong. And so, with 600 men, he marched forward. Into history, into legend, into what would become his final battle. The stage was set. The rolling hills and rugged bluffs of Montana Territory stood as silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. By June 24, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had maneuvered his 7th Cavalry near the valley of the Little Bighorn River. He had orders to locate and contain a large gathering of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, but to wait for reinforcements before engaging. Yet history has proven one thing about Custer. Waiting was never an option. 2 days earlier, General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon had coordinated with Custer's forces, forming a three-pronged plan to trap the Native American encampment. Custer's column was to approach from the south, while Gibbon and Terry advanced from the west. In theory, it was a sound strategy, one that could have overwhelmed the tribes. But in reality, betrayal, ambition, and poor communication would spell disaster. Custer's men were tired after days of hard marching. His scouts warned him repeatedly. The native force was far larger than anticipated. Some said there were thousands of warriors, a far cry from the manageable resistance Custer had expected. Yet despite the warnings, he pressed forward. Perhaps he sought another glorious victory. Perhaps he knew turning back would damage his reputation beyond repair. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he suspected he had no allies left to rely on. As dawn broke on June 25th, Custer divided his forces into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to attack the southern end of the sprawling native camp along the Little Bighorn River. Captain Frederick Benteen, with another detachment, was sent west to scout for any escaping groups, or so Custer claimed. Custer himself, leading 5 companies, would advance along the high bluffs to the north, planning to strike the encampment from above. What happened next has been debated for generations. But one thing is clear: Custer's plan quickly unraveled. Reno's charge faltered almost immediately, facing a withering assault from hundreds of warriors led by Gall and Crazy Horse. Reno's men broke ranks, retreating in chaos across the river to a defensive position on the bluffs. It was a rout, and Reno did little to rally his men. Some historians believe Reno's hesitation may not have been mere cowardice, but a calculated move. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen, tasked with scouting, deliberately lingered far from the action. His orders were vague, but Benteen's decision to move slowly and refuse to reinforce Custer has fueled speculation of intentional sabotage. Benteen despised Custer, who he saw as reckless and glory-hungry. Some historians suggest that by withholding support, Benteen may have hoped to see Custer humiliated, or worse. And so, Custer was left isolated. As Reno cowered on the bluffs and Benteen delayed, Custer's 210 men found themselves surrounded by a force of nearly 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Led by Sitting Bull's vision and Crazy Horse's brilliant tactics, the native forces swarmed the ridge. Custer's famed aggressiveness, his willingness to charge headlong into the fray, was now his downfall. Witnesses from the native side described the scene as a fierce, chaotic melee. Warriors on horseback encircled Custer's men, cutting them down with rifles, bows, and war clubs. Some soldiers fought to the bitter end, while others attempted to flee, only to be hunted down in the ravines. By the time the gunfire ceased, Custer and every man under his immediate command lay dead.